Hello and welcome to the RAIC Corporate Affiliate Series. My name is Pamela Burke and I am the Education Administrator at the RAIC. Our corporate affiliate for today's webinar is DesignABLE Environments, Inc. DesignABLE Environments, Inc. is one of Canada's oldest and leading consulting firms that provides expertise to public and private sector clients on how to design the built environment to meet the needs of all people, including persons with disabilities and the elderly. DesignABLE Environments has been instrumental in developing and popularizing the philosophies of both barrier-free and universal design. DesignABLE Environment staff work within project teams to ensure that team members gain a true understanding of the complexities, challenges, and opportunities associated with accessibility. DesignABLE Environments has an extensive track record as accessibility consultants on local and international projects, including residential, commercial, educational, judicial, recreational, institutional, and healthcare projects. DesignABLE Environments is skilled in the interpretation and application of a variety of accessibility standards and best practices to provide supportive built environments that promote independence, dignity, and safety for all. Today's presentation is titled Accessible Site Plans in an Urban Landscape, presented by Thea Kurdi. A few additional points of information before we begin. You are welcome to ask questions throughout the session via the chat feature on your screen. The questions will be gathered up and given to the presenter, at which time they will be answered. If you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the chat feature to inform us. Lastly, please be sure to complete the post-event survey, which will be sent within a few days of the webinar. RAIC members are eligible for a certificate of attendance. Completion of the survey is required before the certificate will be issued. And now, today's presentation.
Welcome to the RAIC Corporate Affiliate Series. This is the December 11th webinar based on accessible site designs in an urban landscape. So we have 5 items that we're going to be covering in the agenda today. The first is a quick introduction to the presentation. The second is understanding the law and looking then at the overview of the Ontario AODA Design of Public Spaces, which has been so influential in other provinces and could be quite influential in the development of the Accessible Canada Act. And then an overview also of the Ontario Building Code, which had some updates for the 2020 and some coming updates for 2022. The third thing we'll be discussing is facilitating universal design. What do we mean by universal design and how does that work? The fourth thing, addressing accessibility mistakes we often see in site plans. And then of course, we'll finish up with number 5, resources. So first we'll start with who am I and why am I talking to you about accessibility? My name is Thea Kurdi. I'm the Vice President of DesignABLE Environments. And for the last 20 years, I've been working at DesignABLE Environments, which is Canada's oldest accessibility and universal design specialty firm. It's the only thing that we do. It's a great place to work. It's given us a chance to work on all different kinds of projects, and we do everything from master planning to feasibility studies, to drawing reviews working with design teams, to building audits, to creating accessibility standards for all levels of government and large organizations, and then also getting to do research and education like this webinar today. I'm very proud to serve both on the board of directors for the Universal Design Network of Canada, as well as Arts Build Ontario. And I've been working in the media now with a regular monthly segment on AMI's radio and TV on the Now with Dave Brown show. If you're not already following me on social media, you can follow me on Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, or Instagram. Most of the information I post is on LinkedIn, and it's longer and more detailed because they don't have the character limits. Designable Environments is also available on all of these platforms. We like to share resources and give people heads up about really cool things happening to make your life easier as a designer. Okay, before we dive into the content, let's look at our learning outcomes for today's session. At the conclusion of this session, participants will be able to do 4 things. 1, compare the interaction between the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act and the Ontario Building Code. 2, integrate accessible design improvements and facilitate universal design outcomes for a diverse population. 3, recognize that inclusive design must be equitable by providing access and design that encourage participation and involvement by all individuals. And 4, demonstrate neglected and overlooked elements of site plans that result in inaccessibility. It's an ambitious agenda, so let's get started. First, let's talk about some other accessibility learning opportunities that the RAIC provides to its members. If you missed it, then you probably will be able to get access to the December 4th Accessibility and Urban Planning webinar. If you watch that webinar, you'll find that today's topic dovetails into that previous webinar information. That presentation focused on addressing accessibility concerns in public space design, like sidewalks, rest areas, navigation, and much more. The second learning opportunity you have has been provided by the leadership vision of the RAIC with the creation of an Introduction to Successful Accessible Design course. You can access that course at the RAIC website at raic.org/accessible-design. This course is available for both CEU and graduate level credits. Okay, let's now move into understanding the law, because unfortunately a lot of people don't understand this. We'll be looking at both the AODA as a resource for where your province may be headed if you're not in Ontario, or for review for those in Ontario. And then we'll also be looking at the Ontario Building Code, which has been far more progressive in many ways than the National Building Code or other provinces, and again has been providing leadership that may be focused on what's happening in the Accessible Canada Act. So first, we're going to touch on the hierarchy of our laws. Most people don't realize that our laws have a hierarchy. And the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was changed 38 years ago, said that people with disabilities were equal citizens under the law. Then we changed the Human Rights Code that said places and buildings shall not discriminate against people with disabilities. But neither of these documents tell us as designers how to achieve that. The how-to can be found in the lowest level here, seen as the National Building Code on the left and the Accessible Canada Act on the right. Now, the National Building Code, unfortunately, or provincial building codes or your territories, may not actually live up to the hierarchy set by the Charter of Rights and the Human Rights Code. So it's possible, unfortunately, for us to be following the minimum allowed defined by code, whether that's through the National Building Code or through the Accessible Manitoba Act or the Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or in the coming years, the Accessible Canada Act standards, and still not be compliant with the Human Rights Code. So there is a liability gap. So whenever people are talking about accessibility, they're often looking at what are we doing above and beyond code to make sure that all of the users who are needed on our site and access to our buildings have what they need to get there without filing a complaint. In fact, the Ontario Human Rights Commission has published an article pointing out that there is a relationship to the Human Rights Code and the deficiencies both in the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, known as the AODA, and the Ontario Building Code, often referred to as the OBC. And this long article here can be summarized as follows. The Ontario Human Rights Code has primacy over the Building Code and over the AODA. The Human Rights Tribunal has said that compliance with the OBC is no defense in a complaint of discrimination under the Human Rights Code. Many businesses, even large and sophisticated ones, are under the incorrect impression that complying with the building code, that they are meeting all of their legal obligations. Many business owners have expressed the following. have expressed frustration regarding the confusion caused by the discrepancies between the requirements of the OBC and the Human Rights Code. So again, this idea, if you follow the code, you're not necessarily protected from your human rights obligations. All right, let's have a quick look at what the AODA requires at a provincial level and what may be in the future requirements or additional contract requirements for procurement where you are working in Canada. So let's have a quick look at the overview of the AODA's design of public spaces, which is the only standard that relates to the built environments. The goal of this standard is to make Ontario accessible by 2025. Now that's not just for this standard, that's the goal of the AODA itself. And the AODA principles include 1, ensuring that users have a sense of dignity. 2, a sense of independence. 3, that they're truly integrated into the design. And 4, there's an equal opportunity for people to participate. So this focus of this legislation on the site as opposed to urban planning is the intersection where people cross from the city itself onto your site for around the building. And here we see a graphic that helps to better explain the regulation for accessibility for the built environment as opposed to the other types of standards that are part of the legislation as well. So the AODA is trying to cover accessibility very holistically. It includes customer service, it includes information and communication, it includes employment, it includes transportation. Unfortunately, none of those other standards actually talk about the built environment implication. So many of the designers that we work with are struggling to try to figure out, how do you hire people with disabilities from the employment standard, or as the employment standard discusses, without thinking about the built environment implications to the workplace? How does information communication get sabotaged if you're not including the built environment components or customer service components? How does transportation have this? Unfortunately, right now, we only have the design of public spaces, which is shown here on the right, the accessibility standard for the design of public spaces, and the Ontario Building Code. Okay, so the AODA, Accessible Standard for the Design of Public Spaces, is a part of the Integrated Accessibility Standards Regulation. So this is just a legal thing that happened to try to speed up the development of the standards, but it's important if you're looking for it or trying to reference it. It focuses on removing barriers in public spaces. So again, here we see a limitation and a conflict with the obligations under the Ontario Human Rights Code. It also applies to new construction and major changes to existing features, so like major renovations. So again, unfortunately, if somebody is not doing new construction or isn't doing a major renovation, we often see people misunderstanding that they are not required to improve accessibility on their site. Well, you're not required under the AODA Design of Public Spaces, but you are required by the Human Rights Code. So again, a discrepancy in the requirements. Here we see that, again, something that most people didn't understand, different from the building code, where when you applied for your building permit, you were looking at the building code that was in use at that time when you applied for permits. But what the AODA tried to do, and most people didn't understand, was that it was looking, when did the building open? So if you started construction in 2013, but we're building something for the Ontario government, it had to comply with the AODA if it was going to be opening in 2015 or later. Same for designated public sector organizations, but the date then was if the building was opening in 2016, or large private sector or not-for-profit organizations if the building was opening in 2017, and then small private sector or not-for-profit organizations had to be compliant if the building was opening in 2018. So a lot of buildings, unfortunately, were not compliant with the legislation as it was written. Fortunately, unfortunately, the government hasn't really enforced this, but if you were wondering if the AODA applies, it certainly does now. In 2020, and we're way past the deadline for compliance. The design of public spaces covers several different areas, including the design of exterior paths of travel, recreation trails, beach access routes, outdoor public eating areas, outdoor play spaces, accessible parking requirements, Obtaining services in public spaces. So this is where we see the 3 places it overlaps with the built building itself. And then maintaining accessible public services. So this is things like shoveling and making sure you're trimming your bushes. Let's have a quick look now at the changes that have happened to the Ontario Building Code. For most of us, when we're working with the building code, even if it's the 2012 version of the code, the 2012 version has been getting addendums. And fortunately in Ontario, the Ontario Building Code is available for free online. There are several other provinces that also offer this great resource, so you can get the latest version and you're not worried about it. You can also use Control F to find and search through the web page to find what you're looking for. Most of the accessibility requirements are in Part 3 because the Part 9, which deals with the residential experience, is basically exempt from accessibility requirements at this point, but we're seeing a push for that change. So in Part 3, which relates to our commercial buildings, Section 3.8 is focused on barrier-free design, and within that we see 3 subheadings: 1 for general, 2 for occupant requirements, and 3 for design standards. In the design standards, I have listed here alphabetically. The requirements include when and where you need to be providing assistive listening devices. What are the accessibility sign requirements? What do you need to do for doors and doorways for accessibility? What do you need to do for drinking fountains? What about exterior walks? And this is where you'll see that there's an overlap with the AODA. So the AODA explicitly says where the building code requires accommodation or has specifics. For example, at exterior walks, it would override the accessibility of the AODA in only those locations. Again, if you're looking beyond code and trying to be more accommodating, following the AODA is often much better or more accommodating than what the building code requires. Then we also see it includes passenger elevating device requirements. It has platform requirements. It has ramp requirements. It has shelves and counters or telephone requirements. It does talk about tactile attention indicators, or the TAIs. Those are the domes you're familiar with at curb cuts. And then for washrooms, it has several different things. It talks about the water closet itself and enclosures. It talks about urinals, the lavatories, mirrors, and washroom accessories. It has specifics about what's required for universal washrooms and the adult change tables in them, or the space for them, and then showers and bathtubs. Finally, it concludes with wheelchair spaces and adaptive seating requirements. And then there's a reserve section, which they'll probably be using with the National Building Code changes that are coming. But you may have been aware that the Ontario Building Code has had a significant number of updates, including alarms, which is outside of 3.8, curb cuts, which is an update of the 3.83, exterior doorways and doors, again, outside of 3.8, doors and door hardware, again, outside of 3.8, power door operators, an update within 3.8, doors and stairs, outside of 3.8, water closet stalls, updated within 3.8, water closets themselves within 3.8, urinals within 3.8, lavatories outside of 3.8, universal washrooms within 3.8, showers and bathtubs within 3.8, and washroom construction outside of 3.8. And then finally, the 14th update that we had for 2020 was controls inside of 3.8. So often when we're thinking about accessibility, we've been taught to only look at 3.8. So this is a pretty good heads up to make sure that you're focusing where accessibility is in the code. And I think this is where we're going to see the developments happening within the code. The idea that accessibility should be segregated in its own separate section seems to be going by the wayside. But also, when they produced the most recent version of the Ontario Building Code, they also provided, coming in 2022, what was going to be happening or expected of you for that. And we can see that there's been a change in the ramp slope, in the ramps themselves, in stairs, again, outside of 3.8, now accessibility requirements. Curved flights at exits, again, outside 3.8. Handrails, again, outside 3.8, and guards outside of 3.8. So again, you can't just think about 3.8 to look at accessibility, you're going to have to be going beyond that. If you're excited about sustainable design, if you're thinking about what can I be doing beyond building code minimums, the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, actually have integrated quite thoroughly throughout them accommodations for people with disabilities or disabled people. And here's a snapshot of the Division of Social Policy and Development Disability. So if you do a quick search for SDGs and disability, you should be able to find this, and it has lots of great information to help you think about how sustainable accessibility really is. Okay, so let's go back to our agenda. We're moving on to item 3 here, facilitating universal design. One of the biggest problems we see in the design industry, and actually systemically throughout our society, is how we think about disability. And one of the biggest limiting factors is a bias about people with disabilities and the way we even think or talk about it. So the most common limiting factor is often referred to as the medical model of disability, where we look at the individual as being the problem. So if the person says, as this graphic is showing, help, I need access, I cannot use this, I have difficulty, and society's response has typically been, okay, but you're the problem. You're the exception, you lack the ability, you're abnormal, you need to be fixed. And of course, that's completely backwards and very limiting and very disabling. Instead, what we're seeing is society moving to what's called the social model of disability, where the individual at any stage of their life, through illness, accident, or aging, might have a change in their needs. So help, I need access, I cannot use this, I have difficulty. Instead, by society is met with, right, we'll remove the attitudinal barriers, the environmental barriers, and provide multiple solutions for you and everyone. So much more welcoming and accommodating, and a smarter, sustainable design. There's actually 2 different ways to do universal design. The traditional definition of universal design is accommodating people to the greatest extent possible. And the methods for doing that included 7 principles that we show here. Principle 1 is thinking about how can I provide equitable use? So if design is about problem solving, using these principles helps you to think differently about how you're approaching your design. Principle 2 is thinking about how is the flexibility in use? So for example, all you left-handed people out there know how right-hand biased the world is. How could we be making things that are left and right-hand friendly? Principle 3 is about simple and intuitive use. Principle 4 is perceptible information. Principle 5 is tolerance for error. Principle 6 is low physical effort. And principle 7 is size and space for approach and use. If you kept these principles in mind as you're doing your problem-solving design, you're going to get to a much more accommodating, much more flexible, and much more inclusive design. But more recently, we've seen a development of 8 goals of universal design. And you'll notice that there's quite a bit of overlap, but a different way of approaching it. So the first of these goals is about body fit, a wide range of body sizes and abilities. The second is about comfort. How do you make sure that the desired limits of body function and perception are being met? Number 3 is about awareness, ensuring that the critical information of use is easily perceived. Number 4 is understanding, making methods of operation and use intuitive, clear, and unambiguous. Number 5 is wellness, contributing to health, promotion, avoidance of disease, and protection from hazards. Number 6, social integration, treating all groups with dignity and respect. 7, personalization, incorporating opportunities for choice and the expression of individual preferences. And finally, cultural appropriateness, reflecting and reinforcing cultural values and the social and environmental context of any design project. This is a challenge of being a designer in today's world, but these goals or these principles are meant to help the problem-solving aspect of the design process. And again, if we thought about the way we traditionally think about accessible design or people with disabilities, is we think about them as being a them, not an us. But if we thought about the human condition is a lifetime of changing needs and abilities, of changing ages, temporary disabilities. There are so many different ways that any one of us is, if we're not born with a disability, is an illness, accident, or aging from getting one. So it isn't a matter of what percentage of the population are there, how many of them need this. It's at any time we have our needs changed. And if you thought about the Charter of Rights and if you thought about the Human Rights Code, we shouldn't be precluding or excluding anybody. It doesn't even make any sense. So let's get back to our agenda here. Item number 4 is now the meat and potatoes of this presentation, addressing accessibility mistakes that we often see in site plans. The very first of this is about color contrast. Color contrast is a very powerful way to help guide people, help differentiate different things that you have. And often if you're working with procurement contracts, you may have already started to encounter luminescence contrast requirements. And the requirements for this type of contrast, which is both color and tone, that's what luminance is looking at, is 50 to 70%. You don't want to have 100% contrast, particularly on the floor. You don't want to have black against white because it reads as a whole for too many people. So we have to be careful that we're hitting the right balance. 70% is considered optimal, but 50% does give you some choice. And this picture here that came from the Lighthouse Institute, which is about designing for people who are blind in the States, has a great graphic helping to better show effective color contrast and tonal contrast between the color wheel. And here showing that a blue on a yellow is much easier to see than a red and an orange. The other big thing that we see happening or forgetting to happen in a site plan is what I call connecting the dots. So here we see some images that came from the ADA Americans with Disabilities Act guidelines that help to better identify. And what I often encourage my designers to do is to sit down with their site plan, figure out where their different amenities as they're approaching the site are, and use a highlighter to connect the dots. How do I get from that point to the entrance? And that could be from the very corner of the site where the curb cut is to the entrance. It can be from, and we can see this picture on the left. On the left-hand side of the picture, we see the accessible parking and getting from the parking, from the access aisle, up the curb cut, and then across the pavement to the front entrance. In the center right, we see a bus stop and getting from the bus stop across the driveway to the front entrance. And then from the drop-off area on the right, or at the top right of the picture, getting from the access aisle at the drop-off, up a curb ramp onto the sidewalk, and then from the sidewalk or across the plaza to the front entrance. Again, if you were thinking about disability in a holistic way and not just people using wheelchairs, you would be thinking about how would somebody who's blind or deaf or autistic, someone who has fatigue issues, what are their needs to get there, and how would they do that with dignity, respect, and independence, right? As we were talking about with the AODA. On the right, we see an image offering choice. So some people find using ramps very difficult because of their needs or for stability reasons. So here we've seen the design be inclusive or using the universal design principles that we were talking about, where we have a path on the left that includes a couple of stairs and the path on the right that has a ramp. So while a ramp can be used by everyone, and generally, if you have to make a choice, provide the ramp and a low slope ramp if you can, but if not, try to provide both. Now, also thinking about path of travel, if we think about the parking access aisle, as we saw in the picture above, and we don't see in the picture here, we see a user with a power chair coming out of a side entrance with a drop-down ramp from their van, their modified van, and they're coming into the access aisle. Well, one of the issues with the access aisle is that the minimum allowed by code or required by the AODA is not technically wide enough for most people to be able to get off their ramp and have the turning space at the bottom of the ramp to go to. But if you look on the right-hand side of this picture, where does the access aisle dead end into? It dead ends into a curb that's simply a separation between the road or the driveway and the parking. It's not an accessible path. So this gentleman in the wheelchair, what is his path to get to the entrance from this parking space? Most people in most situations, unfortunately, have not been designing, thinking about how to keep people, particularly seated people or shorter people who are harder for parked cars to see. In this case, they wouldn't have a sidewalk to get to, so they would be having to use the driveway. And this is where we see, unfortunately, far too many accidents. So again, plan it. Where does it need to be? And if it can't be immediately against the building, then you have to provide a sidewalk to access it. We also see this kind of thing, a path of travel. So this is an art installation of some long poles, like really long poles, like maybe 20 feet long, that are about the diameter of a cantaloupe or a small melon. And they were implanted in the middle of a sidewalk. Unfortunately, they for artistic purposes, they've been bent over, putting many of them at head height with no barriers to prevent this. So there's nothing wrong with putting artwork into public spaces or onto your site, but you just have to think a little bit about, if kids were running around here, they're probably not paying attention. People who are walking through here looking at their cell phone are probably not paying attention and can hit their head and get hurt quite badly. And of course, people who are blind, there's no way that they would be able to safely navigate this, as there's really no warning about it. It would be very confusing. In fact, if you were coming from the left-hand side of this picture, what the heck is this thing? How do I get around it? Why is it here? So yes, have art, fantastic, but think a little bit about it, right? It wouldn't be hard to make this more accessible, but does it really need to be in the middle of a sidewalk? Again, thinking about rest areas. So the distance your parking has to your front entrance is a critical part of good accessibility these days, particularly designing for our aging population. And it's a requirement under the AODA to provide rest areas. And the picture on the top right is an example here in South Mississauga, where we see that the bench is provided adjacent to, but not blocking the sidewalk, with clear floor space on both sides of the bench so that people using mobility assisted devices or parents with strollers can be on either side of the bench. And just below that, we see the City of Mississauga FADS requirements that show the bench itself with the backrests and the armrests, and then the clear floor space from a mobility device beside it and the dimensions required for that. Each rest area really needs to have a level accessible surface, so just drainage. The rest area really should be spaced at maximum 30 meters, and if you can do it even closer or you're looking at your population needs, be careful. Make sure that the bench itself has the back and armrests I mentioned, as well as the wheelchair spaces immediately adjacent so that the person sitting in the assisted device is sitting shoulder to shoulder with the person sitting next to them on the bench. And then providing a color and texture difference on the surface underneath and between the bench itself and the surroundings helps people to find it, particularly if they have vision loss issues. Stairs themselves, again, is a part of the AODA design of public spaces and in many other municipal standards. And what we see here is if you have exterior stairs, you have to have warning surfaces at the top of the stairs or an entry point to the stairs. You need to have continuous handrails around the landings unless there's a door. You need to have extensions on those handrails on both sides. I know the building code doesn't say you have to have it, but if you don't have a choice, if you're using the left or the right hand side, for example, if you're an amputee or had a stroke, you need to have those extensions, and particularly extensions are important for people who have low vision or who are blind. The tactile attention indicators, as mentioned, need to be at the top or any entry point on the landings, and there are requirements for the position of that. The color contrasting of the nosings has to be at the top of the nosing. It can't wrap down around the face of the nosing so that you can carefully and consistently see the edge of that stair. And then lighting levels, obviously, and signage. So if you're moving throughout your site, you must have proper stair provided. But having said that, the AODA also requires every single path in your site plan also has to be accessible. So no longer can we have, well, this is not an accessible path. If you have a path that has some stairs, you probably can only really fit in a few stairs because you're also going to need to have a ramp. So as mentioned earlier, you can have stairs and ramps together or ramps only at a low slope. You want to make sure you're thinking about the locations. You want to make sure you've got the slope correct and the color contrast to differentiate the level areas of the landings and the slope of itself. The best designs I've seen is where the ramps are entirely color contrasted. The size of the landings, the handrails on both sides. You want the handrails to be continuous. They want to have to be at the top and bottom, have extensions on both sides and be color contrasted. And of course, just like with stairs, make sure they have the proper lighting level and signage. One of the biggest problems we see when we're using pavers, or as this picture shows here, bricks for exterior surfaces, is the frost heave effect. In fact, many of the projects we've worked on, within 2 to 3 years, we go back to the site and find, unfortunately, it wasn't installed properly. So do you have a frost slab? Do you have the proper base for this? Perhaps this is even an argument for having heated sidewalks so that you don't have this type of upheaval, because of course this surface in this rumpled, huge gaps, lifts in the pavers is no longer accessible and has to be replaced and fixed, which is very expensive. We also see a lot of people starting to get into trying to use turf as a part of their accessibility strategy. That would be done better if we were using some sort of enforcement mesh underneath the grass. And we're often seeing the reinforcement mesh is being used if there's like parking that's happening occasionally onto the grass. But if you're including your grass as a part of your assembly areas, then reinforcing mesh would help to make it a more accessible and inclusive than if it wasn't there. So certainly something most of their designers are interested to hear about, but haven't thought about for themselves. And then of course, as we typically mention when we're talking about accessibility, it's one thing to be planning for designing for the best perfect conditions, but what's the reality in our Canadian environments is that we have winter conditions and less than ideal conditions. How are we planning for those worst conditions where sidewalks are not cleared, curb cuts get blocked by snow from the plows, the street plows? So how do you get access to that? Well, on the picture on the left, we can see somebody who's been forced off the sidewalk because it's not cleared and is now traveling on the road, which is obviously not safe. The picture on the right is from the University of Michigan, that actually, as a part of their sustainability plan, realized that they can use the waste heat from the building and their solar generators to heat their sidewalks and paving to create a salt-free, so again, less maintenance. It's cleared when it's needed, so you don't have to worry about, is your maintenance staff on site at the right time? And you can see that they were replacing their entire infrastructure piece by piece by using heated sidewalk tubes. Now, the exterior site, you're often intersecting with the city. So sometimes that's your jurisdiction and sometimes it's the city jurisdiction. The most important thing to be thinking about here is making sure you have the slope correct, you have the side slopes correct, that you have the tactile attention indicator at the bottom of the slope, but far enough back to give people a warning they're about to leave the pedestrian area. The use of color contrast, and making sure primarily, and probably most importantly, that the curb cuts are directional themselves so that people who are blind are not wandering out into traffic by mistake. The other thing that we can use, particularly in large sites, is to help people from a drop-off area, or for example here, as well as a bus stop, by providing something called a tactile directional indicator tile that can lead people to the accessible entrance of the building itself. So here we see a light gray sidewalk with a dark gray tile. The long bars are an international standard that help people follow them to a particular location. And here you can see another example of this done in Korea when I was in Seoul, Korea a few years ago. And the extensive use of tactile directional indicators was both in use and evidence here in Korea, but also in Australia and in Europe as well. So we're a little bit late to this party. It's very well defined internationally, and something that we're seeing the latest versions of accessibility standards and legislation is looking at incorporating. So you can be ahead of the game. Here's an example in an American university, helping people navigate independently through a large, complex campus with tactile maps and helping people to find them. The tactile attention indicators, or the domes here, again, is an international standard to help people who are following the tactile directional indicators realize that this is a decision-making point. Signage and wayfinding is something that people typically don't think about, and they certainly don't think about soon enough, because you have to be planning the size of your sign, because the text has to be consistent with how far away are people going to be reading it. You need to be using a particular sans serif font, so you don't get to just use anything that you like. It has to be readable, and sans serif is the most readable. You have to be providing good color contrast, and we see examples here on the right of all of these things. You have to be providing Braille. Now, the picture on the middle right is showing how the Braille can be put on a bent angle, so that if it gets, one of the biggest problems we see is that Braille that's put too low on the wall is very hard to read because of the angle of your wrist. So by putting on a little bent ledge like this, you can put the Braille on there and it's easy to use. You have to make sure it's placed at the right height so that you can see it, and there's technical requirements for that. Tactile maps are very useful, and we'll have a look at a couple of those. And of course, using shape and color, and try to use as many different methods as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner that Disney World has provided in their parking signage. So here we see an example of wayfinding and tactile maps where we have raised line maps. They're very clear to read. They help everybody. They have legend that includes Braille. They have Braille itself on items on the map. But I have to think about how high would I have to reach to have access to this. And one of the things that's not shown here is a headphone jack for someone who couldn't read or couldn't read clearly, or maybe needed some help. We're seeing the integration of audio with these maps becoming a central part of accessible signage everywhere. Here's another really good example of a tactile raised line map to help people navigate their way through a complex situation and get access to particularly major elements of the site, including safety features and orientation. Unfortunately, exterior site seating is someplace that people typically don't think their way through. So we see two different examples here of somebody getting really playful, and I don't want to knock being playful, but neither of these seating options are accessible. And in fact, on the seating that we see on the left here could be a problem for someone who's not paying attention. So it might be cane detectable for someone who's using a cane to tap it and find it, but someone who's walking, again, looking at their cell phone, looking over their shoulder, maybe has a head cold or not paying attention, they could hurt themselves on this type of seating. And the problem with both of these seats is that they don't have backrests or armrests. And particularly for an older population or people with many different types of disabilities, the stability of having a backrest is really important. And the armrest is important for helping to get up and get down. So here we see a couple of better options for seating. The one on the left is probably the most traditional. It's got really good color contrast and it has armrests on both sides. This is a pretty good example. It's got most of what you need. But what we see on the right-hand side is individual seats that have armrests between each seat. But the last seat, and hopefully we'll see this a little better in an upcoming picture, doesn't have an armrest on one side. This is called transfer seating, which allows people who are sitting in their mobility device to be able to get out of their mobility device and sit next to themselves, which helps relieve pressure points and give a bit of relief. So here's a better close-up vision of that type of transfer seating. Now, unfortunately, this type of seating, as good as it is, because it has the backrest and the armrests have been actually created as a part of what is known as defensive architecture to try to keep people from laying down on the benches. So this has all kinds of social implications. So this is why I've given it a question mark here. I think you need to be balancing what are your objectives in your seating, and is this the right answer? Often what we're seeing in more progressive designs is the armrests are maybe designed thinking about how could you slip your feet through that. The transfer seat on the right-hand side would be kept, but the armrests between the seats in the middle would be removed, and then we'd only have the armrest on the far left. This would allow for wider and heavier people, or people who need to sit more closely with perhaps their children, or, as I said, for someone to be able to lay down if that's appropriate. So again, your clients' needs are often driving these decisions, but there are things to be thinking about here, so important. And then, of course, we're also seeing this, what I call perch seating, which is not really a bench and is not accessible to a great number of people. It's too high for short people or for children. Really doesn't provide a lot of support, and it's really, again, a defensive architecture move. We don't want you staying here for too long, move along. But now we see the picture that we saw before more expanded, and what we also see is the conflict or some of the issues that we see on site around bike storage. So as people all want to be biking, where is that storage happening? Is it blocking the path of travel? Is it close enough to seating, or is it too far from the entrance? Is it blocking the path of travel to access the other facilities you have on site? And as we mentioned before, the best type of idea is using amenity zoning. So are things organized in a way so that people can find what they need, but they're not blocking the path of travel, and perhaps they're using color contrast and texture underneath those elements to help better draw people's attention. So what's good about this bike storage is that it's horizontal storage, not vertical storage. That's much more accessible to a greater number of people. But what's bad about this is its placement and the lack of definition. And again, when you're thinking about biking, too many people are thinking about, the athlete in their bike suit. But people with disabilities bike too. People who can walk short distances can use hand pedal bikes. There's all different types of bike options out there. It's not something we're familiar with looking at, so often we're not planning for it. So again, if from a universal design perspective, or from that social model of accessibility, we could be including more people. Now, another thing that a lot of people are only just starting to think about is all of those guide dogs and service animals that people are using. Guess what? They need a place to go to the bathroom too. So, like if we can grow up for a minute and stop getting silly about the dogs needing to go to the bathroom, this is one of the requirements that we see in, like, for example, the City of Calgary standards, or the CNIB's clearing our path standards, and animal relief area. So what we see in the picture on the right is a bench where people can sit while their dogs get a little bit of off-leash time and get to do their business. There's a water bowl for the dogs. There's a tactile directional indicator that's leading from the entrance to the location with the signage and the garbage. And in this case, they've generously also offered, I'll do that again. They have generously offered poop bags as well. So this type of facility with a fence around it in close proximity, and typically within 30 meters of the closest entrance, is very inclusive design and very advanced. We see this in more and more of the projects we're working on. The next thing we often see on sites now being added are public charging stations. So mobility device charging stations, just like you need to charge your cell phone. If you're out using your scooter or your electric wheelchair, perhaps you've got stuck someplace and you need to be getting a charge. So here are some standards that we're starting to see applied. This is from Sarnia, Ontario. But we're seeing these here in Mississauga now, and I know throughout the country, people are starting to look at these as well. So coming to your site soon. And then playgrounds. Unfortunately, the AODA or most of the other accessibility requirements and legislation really don't have any specific requirements for playgrounds. So I just wanted to give you a couple of great ideas, because a lot of people think about the ramps to the play areas. That's pretty typically well covered. But if you thought about the ground level play that people could have, putting in a canoe is a great way to do it, but cutting out the side of the canoe means people with mobility devices or who can't climb over the edges can play too. My son liked playing in these areas because he could run around really quickly and not get stopped by barriers. So it was harder for his friends to catch him when they were playing tag. And then this type of thing, which is great for both a water feature or for sand features. I know parents hate those sand pits because the kids just come back just with sand everywhere. But if your kids want to play with you, maybe bending down to play in the sand is not very comfortable, or maybe doesn't feel very sanitary. So providing raised tables for water play or for sand allows people with mobility devices to wheel right up and play right alongside and not feel segregated or marginalized or forgotten. And allows parents to play with bad backs or grandparents to play with their kids. So much more of a community idea. And then, of course, talking about communities, we're starting to see a lot more about community gardens. And one of the great things about having a raised community garden is, again, if you can't bend down or if you're in a seated position, you can still touch and smell and participate and plant. And this is particularly great for kids often gets people much more interested in the foliage around them. And then we also see extensive green roofs being used. And this is great for accessibility in many different types of sites, particularly in urban landscapes that are tight for green space at grade, to provide some exterior space, and particularly for different types of disabilities. If you have difficulty with memory loss and for different conditions like Alzheimer's, this is an area that perhaps is enclosed enough that you could be provided with some independent time to be out in the world and not worry about getting lost. It also provides us with access to places to eat outside, get access to fresh air, and obviously it's a way to beautify our sites in a way that we might not be able to down a grade. We're also seeing extensive green roofs as a part of the food culture, the 100-mile diet or the 100-kilometer diet. You know, we're seeing schools and hospitals and universities growing food up on their roofs. So how can we be making these spaces more accessible by thinking about the path of travel, by thinking about the surface, by thinking about the planters themselves, so that people of any age and any ability can be involved with the growth of that food. Outdoor eating areas is also part of the AODA, so it's a requirement for you to be including accessibility as a part of your outdoor eating spaces. But unfortunately, again, it doesn't specify very clearly how to do that. So again, if you were thinking about any amenity, you want to look at the path of travel, the clear floor space around the tables, the knee space at accessible sections, the number of accessible sections you have. Unfortunately, as shown here in this picture, far too often the bench only has one spot for a person with a mobility disability to be at the picnic table at the end. We got a panic call from one client, a university client, where they had a wheelchair basketball team tournament happening. And they suddenly realized all of their outdoor spaces couldn't allow people to be eating outside for that tournament together. So there are new designs. You just have to look for them so that you could have more than one person or adaptable seating that can fold out of the way so that as many people with mobility disabilities can sit together. Parking and storage for scooters is something else that we often see not considered. If you go to an old age home at lunchtime or at dinner, you might see the valet parking for all the assistive equipment leading away from the dining area. So how is that being accommodated? It's not something we typically address, but could. And of course, level accessible surfaces that are easy to get to and maneuver. Again, once we start thinking about COVID, we started seeing people trying to get out. Obviously, we wanted to get out of our houses and enjoy the outdoors, good for mental health, good for wellness. But how did we do that in a safe way? And we started to see designers and urban planners painting white circles onto grass. If I'm blind, how do I find a white circle? So this is a design problem that we haven't yet solved. And is the grass surface actually accessible for people who are unsteady on their feet, who are using canes or mobility devices? Did we remember to include any circles on a paved surface or an accessible surface as well? Often the answer is no, but that's something that we could be doing very easily. Passenger pickups and drop-off areas, they're often struggling. So here's one from downtown Toronto. You can see the CN Tower in the background, and you can see that the sidewalk is completely flush with the roadway right beside it, with no tactile attention indicator like you would see at a curb cut surrounding the drop-off area. The bollards themselves have no color contrast because they're silver on a gray material, so they're very hard to see. And you can see that they've sort of been pushed around, so they're hard for the cars to see that are trying to maneuver in this space. But if you were blind, imagine the travesty of potentially walking out of this sidewalk and into the busy road next to it. And as we were talking about before, if we're trying to connect the dots from the drop-off area to the entrance, how are we designing this properly? And here we see a really good example in Mississauga where they've remembered the key ingredients here. You have to leave the driveway open and available for other cars to get past. That's the first arrow on the right. The second arrow is showing the lay-by where the car is going to stop, because people who are offloading with mobility devices or with certain types of disabilities might take a few minutes to actually get out of their car. So if you are blocking the driveway, how is that functioning for the site circulation that you have? And then beside the car, the third arrow working from right to left, or the second arrow from the left, is pointing out the access aisle that's required at the same level as the driveway itself. And then the last arrow on the left-hand side is showing the curb cut that the access aisle leads to so that people can get up onto the sidewalk heading towards the front entrance. So this is a pretty good design, including most of the elements that you would still like to be seeing and are often forgotten. And again, getting back to this idea of scooter parking, I'm seeing this when I was in Victoria and when I was in Calgary, when I was in downtown Toronto, when I was down in Halifax. We're starting to see that people may not find the interior of the facility to be accessible to their scooter, so they're leaving them parked outside. If you haven't thought about where that's going to happen, people are just going to leave it wherever they want. That may or may not work. And as you can see here, one of these scooters is blocking one of these doors. So not great planning, but again, something we could easily do. Again, maintenance is required under the AODA, and something we is a part of snow clearing. It's a part of making sure your trees are trimmed, so you're not creating overheight hazards, that your bushes are trimmed so that you have the clear width for travel. Making sure that you have this done correctly is a really important thing, especially if you're going to start focusing on community mental health, which encourages a lot of plants. Stramps, oh boy. In fact, if you look up under accessible stairs, unfortunately on the internet, you're going to see something like this picture on the right-hand side. It's called a stramp. It's a mix of a stair and a ramp mashed together. When I was in school 20 years ago, this was the epitome of what people thought of as universal design. It's actually been proven to be unsafe for all users. It's important when you're designing stairs. If you remember, the rise and run of the stairs should be predictable and consistent throughout the stairs. And you can see with the ramp crossing the stairs, you're not going to get that. If you're using the ramp, there may not be an edge to help you from falling off one of the stairs or having one of your wheels fall off the stairs and causing a tipping hazard. The ramp is generally too steep or too long. The ramp should never be more than 2 meters of height difference. If you're using a ramp on a site, it should never be more than 2 meters, and that's an international standard. Unfortunately, our legislation doesn't specify that. And if you're using the stairs, you're going at opposite directions to the people who are using the ramps. So you have conflict in the user directions of path of travel. And if you're using the stairs or the ramps, you have very little access to the support of handrails. So bad design, don't do this. Or, oh, goodness, even worse, hangout steps. There's nothing accessible about this type of space. It looks cool. It's a part of the sort of amphitheater, a get it gathering kind of thing, but there's only stair access to most of the levels here. And those stairs don't have handrails on both sides, as of course they would need to in order to meet their accessibility requirements. So if, yes, somebody could sit at the top and look at if there was a gathering, if something at the bottom, or they could, if they could get to the bottom, they could be at the bottom. But if your friends are hanging out in the middle, how would you be able to get to them if you couldn't climb those stairs? They're very difficult to navigate for people who are blind as well. So very cool. A lot of people thought they were really cool, but actually when you think about it, actually a barrier to too many people and discriminatory. And then of course, lighting is really important. You don't want it, as this drawing is showing us here, you want your lighting to be very even, not like this, where we have hot spots and cold spots, which make it difficult to navigate, which make it seem scary, which could hide dips or tripping hazards or make people feel like there's a hole in the ground. You want to make sure you're getting your lighting right. And that might feel like it's a bit of a conflict with our sustainable goals. But if you think about the safety of the users on the site, there are definitely ways to be doing this to avoid glare, to avoid light shining in your eyes, but still get the light where you need it down the ground. So we'll finish up with this picture here. Again, a quote from Neil Milliken, who's an accessibility specialist in IT. And I really loved this quote from him recently at a conference. Where it says, "Poor accessibility is the externality of the production and planning process. It's a kind of pollution and it's unnecessary." And the picture we see on the right is of a woman who's using a scooter, and it's an outdoor rugged kind of scooter, so the wheels are a little bit bigger. And the person who's created the gate for the pedestrians to use wasn't accommodating for the different types of user needs. And this woman who's trying to bend her head under this may or may not actually be able to fit either herself or her backrest behind. So finally, let's finish with resources. First, I want to introduce you to a free resource, the AODA Design of Public Spaces, which, as I said, is a very influential document, has an illustrated technical guide that's been made available for free by the Gates organization. This not only includes technical drawings and resources for what the legislation requires, it also includes best practice. So if you're looking for things above and beyond code, this is a great free resource. The Canadian Standards Association also includes the B651 standard. Now, the most current version is the B651-18, but I've listed here that they're the -12 version, just as a bit of a warning to you, because there is a -12 version. There is a -12 R 2015 and R 2017 as shown here. So you really have to be careful if someone's asking you to follow the CSA B651 that you know which version of that document you are actually following, and you have to purchase it. So make sure that you're purchasing the right one. Also, you want to note that the CSA B651-18 is being reconciled right now with the National Building Code. So many of the requirements in this are going to be a part of our future legislation. And I'm anticipating that this will also be influencing the Accessible Canada Act standards. The CNIB, or the Canadian National Institute for the Blind, has a Clearing Our Path and color contrast set of requirements that are also available for free from clearingourpath.ca. And they have specific design needs that are accommodating for people who are blind and have vision loss. The City of Mississauga, along with over 100 different municipalities across Ontario, across Canada, and even in other places in the world, have adopted something called the Facility Accessibility Design Standards. So you'll see that there's a great set of standards in Calgary, there's a great set of standards in Winnipeg, in Ottawa, and in almost every municipality in Ontario. They're all a little bit different. Some of them are available for free, like the City of Mississauga. Again, this is above and beyond code. So if you're looking to fill that gap for what's missing from the building code, what's missing from the AODA to help you better achieve the human rights requirements, this is a really good free resource, and it's full of great ideas that is easy to navigate. And then finally, the Centre for Universal Design Australia has a really great article talking about complete streets and the accessibility of health agencies' role in with disabilities and for everybody. I also am excited to introduce you to two other great organizations. The first is 8 to 80 Cities, where they're focusing on creating cities for all people throughout their entire lives. Their website is just full of really good resources. You absolutely have to check them out. And then there's the Smart Cities for All organization that actually has developed a Smart Cities for All toolkit. So even if you're just developing your site, there's some really good things about urban planning and site related issues that are smarter and create more inclusive, accessible design. So our learning outcomes from today's webinar include, at the conclusion of the session, participants can, 1, compare the interaction between the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act and the Ontario Building Code. 2, integrate accessible design improvements and facilitate universal design outcomes for a diverse population. 3, recognize that inclusive design must be equitable by providing access and design that encourages participation and involvement by all individuals. And 4, demonstrate neglected and overlooked elements of site plans that result in inaccessibility. Thank you very much for participating today. There's many more educational opportunities at the RAIC website that you can reach by going to raic.org/continuing education. Hello everyone, Thea Kurdi here. It's an opportunity now for you to ask any questions that you might have. So thank you very much for making time today to participate. If you would like to type in your questions into the chat window, we will be able to hopefully get those questions asked of you or answered for you. I hope you really enjoyed that. This was a pleasure and really exciting for me to put this presentation together, because it's really the culmination of the 20 years of experience I have had with accessibility and getting to share with people the things that I've found and learned is very useful. So I hope you've enjoyed it too.
Doesn't seem like we have too many questions.
Oh, good. I answered everything as I was doing it. I know it's already 2 o'clock, so, or just after 2, so I'm sure there might be some people who had to run, but one of the things that came up was the international standards for tactile directional indicator paths, so, and the tactile attention indicator. So these 2 paths, one's called or they're referred to as tactile walking surface indicators. And there's 2 types. There's TDIs and TAIs. TDI stands for tactile directional indicator, and TAI stands for tactile attention indicator. And the international standard you'd be looking for that's referenced in most places is the ISO 23599 standard. Now, 23599 includes a lot of other things, but it certainly includes the tactile walking surface indicator information that you might be looking for. This has been aligned with the CSA standard. So if you have the CSA standard, you can certainly make that provision through those standards as well. So you don't have to go buy a separate thing if you don't want. But if you see the ISO standard, it's usually being referenced for this particular pathway or these particular types of tactile surfaces.
Okay. We got a nice comment in there for you.
Yes, I can see we have a comment about Stramps. I appreciate to hear your comments on Stramps. I love the idea, but felt they're dangerous. Yeah, that's unfortunately far too often true. It looks like a really cool idea, but once you start thinking about it, and certainly, you know, I think one of the things I would always encourage people to do, particularly in the face of the new Accessible Canada Act, is really embrace the principle of nothing about us without us. As a non-disabled designer, perhaps we're not considering everything the same way perhaps men might not be able to consider all of the needs for women's health issues. It's probably a good idea to be consulting with people with disabilities from the very inception of the project to get their ideas. Once you're starting to put together your design, you want to make sure to be getting from some feedback. And we've done this on many projects. The goal is to try to make sure that you have people who can share diverse opinions about experience, but people with the lived experience obviously can tell us things that perhaps we haven't considered, and I can tell you many of them are not in our building codes or standards yet. I would, yes, okay. I would very much love to hear from anybody. You know, the RAIC would love to hear some feedback from you. So if there's something in particular you thought was terrific about the presentation, please let us know. If there's something you would like to be learning more about to help us plan for our future continuing education credits and webinars, we would love to hear from you as well on that. So, and of course, if you haven't yet registered for the Introduction to Successful Accessible Design course, absolutely check it out, because it is a beginner course. It is really an overview of what accessibility is, but it gets you started with lots of resources and lots of great ideas and lots of things that I know from your problem solving perspective, you're going to find useful.
I just want to add to that we will be sending out a feedback survey for everyone to complete. So please, all of those, you know, lovely comments, please put them in there. There should be a spot. I will double check, but we always appreciate your feedback.
Absolutely. Wendy has just made a note that she's very interested in the previous webinar we did on making presentations accessible. That was done in April as a part of the Accessible Design and Universal Design theme month. And I believe that both that presentation and the presentation the co-owner of DesignABLE, Bob Topping, did on designing for people who are blind, that included a blind participant, are, I believe, also available. So hopefully we can share those resources with you as well. I'm sure if you're following us on social media, you can follow me on Twitter at @tkurdi, or DesignABLE at tweet DesignABLE. And then of course the RAIC is on Twitter as well. If you follow us, if we have access to those, if those are still available for you, I'm sure we'll be posting those soon. Okay, so the RAIC comment is telling us that both of the mentioned courses for designing for the blind and creating accessible presentations are both available at the RAIC store. So if I can find those links, I will be posting them to make it even easier for you to find. But I'm sure that's, if you hop on the RAIC website, you'll find them pretty fast yourself.
I think you've got one more question there, Thea.
Oh yeah, sorry, I missed that from Kevin. Kelvin, sorry. Anyone go through litigation through the Human Rights Code because of inadequate measures, but above Ontario Building Code? So one of the difficulties, there is a place where the Human Rights Tribunal findings are posted. The unfortunate part, and a lot of them initially, like if you look at the people who are filing them, a lot of them initially are about the built environment. But the process is that someone files a complaint. It goes for the initial hearing with the lawyers involved, obviously. And then typically the person who's the defendant in the case, so someone's making a complaint and you're defending your site or your design, the lawyers that you have representing you would listen to the case and give you an opinion about whether or not they think that you have a good defense against this claim, or whether or not they think that the Human Rights Tribunal would be finding against you. In many cases, what I've been told is most of these cases disappear because once they've been told, we don't think you have a strong case here, they're likely to rule against you, that there's a settlement offer made. And this happened as a cautionary tale. This happened to a British Columbia restaurant where somebody made a human rights complaint against this restaurant. And even though this restaurant had been rated as RAIC, sorry, not RAIC, had been rated by the Rick Hansen Foundation for their new building certification. And then when it went to the tribunal obviously was very sympathetic to the complaint, and the settlement offer was made and was accepted by the person who made the complaint. And so the whole thing has disappeared off the records, unless of course you can find the news articles at the time published about it, and then everybody signed a non-disclosure agreement. So it's unfortunate that there's really no way for us to sort of track where the real issues are here, because once those settlements and non-disclosure agreements happen, all of that information is off the books. So it doesn't look like we have any more questions. I really want to say thank you so much for taking your precious time to participate in this. I hope you found it valuable and a good use of your education credit time. And of course, as we are approaching the holiday season, everybody at RAIC and of course everybody at DesignABLE wishes you and everybody in your life the very best for the holidays. And of course, a very accessible new year.
But thank you for attending live, everyone. And thank you again, Thea, it was wonderful. And check back in next year. We'll definitely have more of these webinars.
You're welcome. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Have a lovely afternoon.